Hi, and welcome to another episode of Inspiring Honesty. I'm your host, Greg Bray, and I'm an atheist. Today is Mother's Day, and on that note, I guess that we never really discussed that much in advance what we're going to talk about, and I wanted to focus a little bit on the topic that we talk a lot about, actually, in the New Covenant group in general, and that topic is love, and all of the different forms that it can take. I also wanted to speak to a small extent about family and give a quick anecdote because it's awesome that's unrelated to this topic. Today, because of my interaction with Eric Hovind, I learned that a second cousin of mine, a person with whom I share a great grandfather who I've never met, sent me an email today saying that he had seen that one of our episodes on YouTube and wanted to just connect. And once again, it's been established that anybody with my last name is related to me and pretty closely. So that was pretty exciting. But that's somewhat unrelated to the topic at hand. I just thought it was incredible. And also, he is a fellow atheist and runs a blog. So thought that was interesting as well. Maybe there's something in the bloodlines. Who knows? But on that note, that would be the patrilineal bloodline. And today we'd like to focus a little bit more on the matrilineal, at least at the beginning, and saying, first of all, to anybody out there watching, Happy Mother's Day. And second of all, to my amazing co-host, I'd like to say, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks, Greg. I find you pretty amazing too, and it's good to be here. I've very much enjoyed the topics of conversation that a lot of people don't perhaps don't realize this, that sometimes we just get together and find out what we're going to talk about as we do it. So anyhow, it's great to be here.
I have to say that this is one that's been chewing on me, or I've been chewing on for a while, waiting for the right time to talk about it, and I'm still not entirely convinced that we'll get into everything I want to say today, because I might want to wait until I can get a guest to get into part of this. But specifically, I wanted to talk about love today, and I think that it's a great time to do that because Mother's Day really lends itself to people understanding love in a different context. So frequently, when we consider that term, we look at it in a romantic sense. Now, of course, I think that when most theists, most religious people look at the term love, talking about loving God and being loved by God, it's a completely different understanding. And I think in that way, it is far more or far better represented by the love that a mother and child share. Would you agree with that?
Oh, people use the words in so many different ways, and they don't even stop to identify or define them. That it's amazing to me how many times I end up in a conversation with someone only to discover they really use those words very differently from the way I would. So I'm not really sure where center is or where normal is or the way most people think about it. But I do get the impression that when people talk about this, they're really talking more about the aspect of love that is more commonly referred to as affection.
Okay. I guess I'm not as familiar with the term affection in all of its various usages. I don't run across that one as much, so I'm interested to see what you mean by when I perceive most people talking about God being love, or the love of God, and even when I hear Dr. Jones talking about it, love not keeping a record of wrongs, or similar. I mean, or when I read even First Corinthians, chapter 13, where it talks about all of the qualities of love. I think that in a lot of ways, I don't see that as being representative of only, at least, romantic love. I think that
No,
there's a portion of romantic love that comes to that, and
I
it
I
really is
I gotta be
embodied
honest
in
with
many
you.
ways by parents.
I when I think of the way most theists talk about God being love, I don't get it. I I don't see. To me, there's a huge disconnect between what they think they mean by this word love and the God they talk about. He doesn't strike me as being God of love, given the theology they hold on to. And to me, you know, I think they talk about the love of God in much the same way that a person who was kidnapped and made a victim of their captors for a number of years, who has acclimated to the situation and learned to accept their captivity, might begin to start coping and dealing with it by thinking of their captive or captivator as loving them. I don't really see that strong of a connection between a lot of people who talk about God as love and what they seem to understand love to be. So, even when I was a fundamentalist, I think that even then, my concept of love was developing in a different direction than my theology, and I was avoiding the cognitive dissonance.
That's an interesting point, and I've certainly seen it mentioned, especially in memes and other various internet media, that love of God, in the specifically fundamentalist sense, as better described as Stockholm syndrome, where
Yes.
somebody comes to develop affection for the person who has kept them captive, and that would be an interesting thought experiment to or road to travel down in saying, is the love a child has for its parents just another form of Stockholm syndrome as well? I mean, I look
Often
sometimes
it
at
is. I think it is. Sure. Yeah. Uh,
I have to say, as a father now, I find myself saying things that as a child I never would have thought I would say, and
mhm.
I hated being told when I was a child, and taking a very authoritative stance on some things. Admittedly, I'm working with a 2-year old, but it does in many ways come down to, no, you are going to do this because I told you you are going to do this. And I hope that at some point that does at least manifest in my son respecting me for teaching him how to behave in society. I don't know.
Right.
It's an
Um,
interesting
I don't
question.
know that you can explain to a child that sort of thing. Chances are, um, when we talk about Stockholm syndrome, I don't think we're talking about dynamics that are entirely negative. We're just talking about dynamics that are very negative in that particular context. But I think all human beings, for example, find themselves in a situation where the consequences that will be brought to bear upon them for certain choices do have a way of affecting the way we consider those choices. And this is true irrespective of whether or not those consequences are just or unjust. But it is true that as human beings, we do learn to give a certain level of respect to consequences that are made clear will come to bear. And and so I think there's a sense in which, when it comes to parenting, there is a sense in which those consequences are going to at times appear unjust. But I think that the difference would be that uh, the only time that a real parent will justify doing such a thing is only because the child is at yet a stage where they can't appreciate the consequences they naturally bring upon themselves.
That's true for the most part. I have to say there are also times when it's simply, no, you are going to put your shoes on because we are leaving, and there's no real natural consequences to him disobeying that, other than I am in charge and of deciding when we are leaving, and he is dependent upon me for transportation and care. So I mean,
Right, right.
there's a
You
bit
can't
of a
explain it. It's not going to work. Yeah.
right. There's a bit of a coercive element to that at the very minimum, and I think that it's worth looking into that a bit. I mean, I've heard Dr. Jones say on many occasions, and many people say things along the lines of, if God is love, and love keeps no record of wrongs, then why should we need a an atonement at all? Why would there be um, consequences to something? And I
Well,
think that
consequences are natural and logical. I mean, so, but why should we add additional consequences?
that is a fair point.
Yeah.
But I mean, if we're talking about, and it's hard for me to step back into this position because I was just having a debate with Joey talking about a very pantheistic argument where natural and logical consequences would be the only consequences. But to talk about, again, a supernatural God or a God that is outside of what our current understanding and ability to perceive reality is, um, and one that does love us and that is concerned with our lives, I can actually understand a bit of the fundamentalist argument looking at God as a parent, God the
Hmm.
Father. I mean, they generally give it the or paternal sense, but in having natural or rules and expectations and things for us and consequences that are known to us if we break those rules. And I really, coming just from the position of a parent, can certainly project into at least seeing if there was a God, a purgatory of some sort or a an afterlife punishment would be justifiable in that
Maybe
respect.
not a
It's
punishment, but certainly corrective actions. What you were saying about, the taking the time or the effort to try to convince your little boy that, look, you got to put your shoes on. We're on our way out. There's going to be this can be a difficult thing to overcome, particularly if you have a defiant child. Reminds me of a story that I heard about a mother who every time the kids are in the car, they became very unruly, and particularly if they're on a trip. And as a result, it really discouraged her from even planning any trips. I mean, you're going to go on vacation. Taking an hour to drive to where you're going to go was miserable. So she came up with this plan that was awesome. She came up with a plan that they were going to go visit grandma, and this was like a 2-hour drive. And she actually set the date with her mother, but she didn't tell the kids what the real date was. She actually set out to grandma's house the weekend prior, but she didn't tell the kids this. She just told them, look, I don't want to have any messing around. If you guys start fighting in the car or anything, I'm just going to turn the car around and we're not going to grandma's. And she knew what was going to happen. And sure enough, it did. She said, she stops the car and she tells the kids, look, I told you this, that I don't want to have to talk you into it. I don't have to coerce you into it. I just told you, if you're going to do this, we're not going to grandma's. And she turns around and she drives home. And the next weekend comes along. And when she's saying, okay, should we give this another shot? Needless to say, the second trip went a lot better. But was she being manipulative in some ways? Yes, but at the same time, part of what I think she was successful at doing is something that's very hard to teach a child is to own the fact that their behavior has consequences and that the consequences they suffer are not consequences brought upon them by some authoritative figure, but consequences brought out, precipitated by their own choices. That's a hard thing to teach, but to me, that's really more what the goal ought to be. And of course, that goal is unreachable at certain ages, and so a parent has to, for the child's sake, take a certain degree of control. You know,
I can't argue with that. I mean I may have as a child or even as a teen made what I thought was a very compelling argument against that, but the reality is that I know more now than I did then. I've experienced
yeah.
more, and it's been a learning curve at that level. And I think that there is something that we really need to recognize that I look back now at some of the fights, the arguments. I mean, the knockdown, drag out, screaming matches that I had with my mom when I was a kid, and all I can say to her every time Mother's Day rolls around is, "I'm sorry." And I didn't understand at the time what was going on.
Uh-huh.
But on the other hand, could I have been expected to without
No,
having the experiences that I have today? Um,
not really, not really.
and I
Um,
think that
and
also plays a role into, again, the
and
consequences and the idea of an eternal punishment or any punishment being
right. And if there's a
sadistic.
part of you that can step back from even the authority you must engage in with your own child. If there's a part of you that can kind of, in a parenthesis, without the child seeing, step back and find it kind of cute. The thing you want to avoid is something that most parents fall into, I think, is the selfishness of feeling it's unfair that you have to work with a child who does not yet possess the development to appreciate and understand these things. This is the challenge of parenting. Accept it and enjoy it, and don't let it get under your skin so much, or you'll blow it more often.
I have to tell you, we are potty training. I am proud to say my son
Oh,
Casey is not even 2.5 years old. He'll be 2.5 at the end of next month. And he has been in big boy underpants, not even pull ups, for over a month now. And that includes even overnights. Really proud of that. But
cool.
again, it's been a struggle. It's been a fight. And there were times when we spent 45 minutes in the bathroom until he was willing to sit on the potty, even after he had wet his pants. And it comes a point when I just don't know. I mean, I'm still coming from a position of ignorance. Am I going too far? Should I be saying, well, we can take a break on this, or should I be maintaining the consequences? I had told him, if you don't go on the potty, you're going to have an accident. You're going to have wet pants. What do I do from there? Let it
Right. Well,
happen.
yeah. If the consequences mean nothing to them, then they don't. But you know, so there's a sense in which there is a developmental stage at which they are really ready. I don't think it's proper to personally put a child on a particular schedule just because that's the one you'd like to keep. But they at the same time they usually do need some encouragement, some motivation to get there. But anyway, that's great. That's a good age to be accomplishing that achievement. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Um, I don't know. Bob, I have to confess something here. There's something it's on the tip of my tongue here with this, because I've been chewing on this topic for a long time, but I really don't know if it's the right time to go into it yet. Either way, I think I'm going to. So let's see where it leads. The other part of where this question of love comes in, aside from, of course, the how do we apply that externally, is also how do we analyze it internally, and how do we look at it. I think that love as a concept socially, um, has constructs and things that it's rather and very rather clearly evident that social constructs don't dictate how people do love, just simply how that love can be expressed, sometimes even safely.
Hmm.
And I think that this certainly plays a role in some of the other topics that we've gotten into, things like homosexuality or gender issues in general, and it really does come down to a recognition that love exists even if we don't understand the form that it's coming in.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that that's the topic that I wanted to delve a little bit more into today.
Sure.
Uh, and so, in the past, we talked about homosexuality and as it, or if it is a choice, is it something that people can control? I actually saw a video the other day. I thought it was very, very powerful. It was just some street interviews talking with people who were being asked about what they thought about homosexuality, and they found people that were against it. Said that I think it's wrong. They weren't, forcefully against it. They weren't saying that they thought that it was an abomination or anything like that. But I think it was incredible to see, because in this video they said, "What do you feel, or what do you say about homosexuality?" And they I'm sure cherry picked and asked way more people this than they ended up including in the final. But the next question that followed was, "Do you think it's a choice?" And when the people answered in the affirmative, they asked them a very blunt and straightforward question: "Is when did you choose to be homosexual? Or I'm sorry, when did you choose to be heterosexual?" And there's really
Right.
not a way to answer that. Uh, I
I think
mean,
I
I
saw that
didn't.
video myself as well.
It's a powerful video because what was really powerful about it is the people who recognize that that is a perfectly valid argument, and that they were stunned and they weren't able to answer it, and you could actually see change happening in that. And that's why I think that these topics are so worth going into, is that we need to recognize that even if love doesn't manifest in the way that we think it should or the way that we experience it, that doesn't mean that it's invalid.
Okay. Yeah. Now, of course, I wouldn't I wouldn't define love in a way that was in personally that was any way dependent upon whether or not a person was straight or gay. Personally, so that um, uh, but the love that we may have does manifest itself in the avenues in which it is capable of flowing from us, I suppose. But I, uh, I wouldn't want to confuse. I think a lot of people do attraction with love.
That's very true. But I think that there is a degree of connection between the two. That there's more than just
Oh,
physical attraction.
definitely, definitely, yeah.
I think that there really is a distinction between romantic love and other kinds of love. Now, I mean, I have no problem unabashedly saying that I absolutely love every one of my brothers, and those are other men that I I love completely and with every part
How
of my
many
being.
how many brothers do you have?
I have three brothers,
Oh,
and one sister, and they've all been incredible parts of my life. As a matter of fact, this week I'm blessed to have all of them here. My middle brother, the one anyway, one directly younger than me, is in the Marines and he's home this week, so I get to spend a lot of time with him. But the love that I experience for him is not the same as the love that I experience for my son or for my wife. It's a different kind of love. Um, and I think that it's certainly valid to recognize that both are love, but that they have their own forms as well.
uh-huh.
Um, I guess I don't know how to articulate this or what.
Well,
what
maybe would let me just ask a question, and you can tell me if this has something to do with that. As I'm trying to understand how you would put that into some sort of coherent term. Uh, Water. We need water as human beings, but we can find water in apple juice. We can find it in just water. We can find it in lemonade. We can even find it in soda. Um, so although water may come to us in various different combinations with other things, it, each of those ways in which it may come to us is definitely a different experience, but it's still really all water. And I suppose that when we look at all of the dynamics that are involved in the parent child relationship, in the sibling relationship, in the spousal relationship, that there are different dynamics at work. But do you think there would be a sense in which that element that we would call love could still be the exact same core element in each of those, but just because the dynamics are differently, it it flows differently?
That's certainly an interesting way to look at that. I have to say I'd never considered it in that way, and this is part of why I love having the unconventional pastor here as my co-host. Is you have a way of wording things in a way that I would not have even considered. So, wow, thank you for that.
Sure.
Um, and yes, I think that you're right, at least to some extent. That, but I think also you've talked a lot about the authenticity of experience,
Hmm.
and regardless of whether that experience, even if it was a complete hallucination, it doesn't mean that it's not authentic in its own way, and it's not um, real to you as the observer. And the kind of love or the flavor of love, I guess I wanted to
Hmm.
talk about today a bit more was not the familial love. As a matter of fact, I think that the familial love even extends out in degree to friends.
Sure.
I have very, very close friends that I consider to be brothers. I mean, they are just as close to me. I love them just as strongly as I love my brothers, and that's and sisters. I have a sister as well, and I have female friends that take that role. Um, but the flavor that I wanted to focus on is a bit more on the romantic side of it, specifically because the last time that we focused on, um, uh, I guess, non-traditional love and sexual issues, we focused more on the how somebody could possibly say it is wrong argument, or at least that was where I was coming from, in saying that the only way I can see somebody making an argument that something is wrong is if it's harmful.
Mhm.
um, Today, I wanted to make a case that I think needs to be made more, because there are people out there that experience romantic love in many, many different ways. And that it will be very unpopular for others to say, but I am an advocate for allowing homosexual couples to get married. And that's not what I think is going to be the controversial claim. The controversial claim that I'm about to make here is that I don't want to end there. I think that it is absolutely silly. It is authoritarian and it is wrong for us to limit. Um, I mean, even if we go beyond just the legal contractual side, if we look at love as an incorporation of sorts, I'm sorry, marriage as an incorporation of sorts, then there's no reason that it would need to be by a one man and one woman in that respect, only by two legal um, entities that can make this decision, regardless of who they are, what they or where they come from, what genders they are, and what positions they take. But in every other legal contract that we have, we don't really qualify it by the number. And this is where I am blown away by the argument that so many people say love is between, any two people. And I don't see how that's true. I don't see any reason why love needs to be restricted to two people. And there's plenty of arguments out there for um, why that, and plenty of examples for why that's not the case. And I want to make the argument here that a lot of people say once we start allowing gay marriage, it's a slippery slope, and that the next thing we're going to have to do is allow polygamy, polyandry. Um, I forget the bigamy is I think the other term for it, but I think that's a bit derogatory in its nature. But I don't see why that's wrong, and I'm curious if you have any way of convincing me that that is.
I really don't think so, because I'm probably very close to the same page with you on that. Um, Now, a few things I would say though is this: that for most of us in our culture, we have really only experienced spousal kind of, romantic love in exclusive relationships. And if we can't see why this would be a problem to have, polyandry would be why that would be a problem. Uh, Well, until you're actually in that kind of a context, there may be problems there that you hadn't anticipated, and so it's very likely that there could be some of those difficulties that would crop up in ways. Oh, wow, I hadn't realized that before. I mean, how many times do we go through life and we find ourselves in a situation that we hadn't anticipated there were going to be any real problems, and yet, oh my goodness, look at all these problems. So I do think there can be that. But at the same time, I don't see this as a slippery slope. It all depends on. I mean, slippery slope is a charged term. It implies, first of all, that the ground you're on is not firm and that you can't really stay in place, and that it's going to slide somewhere based on gravity. That argument hasn't. We haven't determined that's the lay of the land or the nature of the ground. And so if we're finding ourselves having to reconsider the sorts of relationships we allow people to enter into contractually, that might really open up a wider variety of possibilities. Um, and I don't see, what's necessarily wrong with that. And fact, if you take a look at even biblical marriage, so-called, you know, David had lots of wives, King David. Solomon supposedly, the account for him was close to 1,000, 700 wives and 300 concubines or something like that. Um, I can't imagine any of those relationships being close relationships or meaningful spousal relationships in terms of the way we think of it. They seem to be more trophies and notches on a belt, I guess. But it, I do think that we have to be honest. There are some people who really don't want that close of a relationship with someone else, but are nonetheless interested in some of the contractual benefits. So, I mean, what would be wrong if you had four people, uh, say two men and two women, who wanted to enter into some sort of a contractual marriage of some sort, and that they each possess certain needs or lack of needs, whether because of damage or differences, who knows, who cares? Um, I personally don't see the need to be worried about that, because if natural so-called marriage between a man and a woman is the healthy normative view, then people who are normal or healthy and naturally developing will gravitate towards that all by themselves. And to think that anything like that has to be protected by a standard is, in my way of thinking, an admission that there's something weak about that standard.
Now, I wanted to go into this topic because I think that you and I do agree on it very strongly in that. And I think that our position on this is probably a pretty significant minority position in most people who have never questioned it. And that's one of my goals with Inspiring Honesty, is to raise questions that people have never considered. Um, because I can tell you that this is something that hit me about 2.5 years ago. I read an article by a blogger who I'd love to get on the show. And I may have him on here at some point if I can coordinate that to discuss maybe this topic or more. But his name is JT Eberhardt, and he blogged about getting involved with a woman romantically who was in a polyamorous marriage. And polyamorous is different than swinging or sexually open
Right.
marriages, but she dated outside of it. And I found it intriguing. I have to tell you, when I first read it, it seemed wrong in a way. It just I don't know. I'm in a very happy monogamous marriage, and it just it didn't make sense to me. That it seemed, no, that's not how marriage works. That's not how relationships work. That's not how love works. Until I had to step outside of myself and I had to look at this and say, am I being prejudiced here? Am I projecting my own personal understanding of reality onto these people and judging them? And
Let me say this. If you don't know what you're talking about and you have an opinion about it, I think you are being judgmental. Are you also incorrect? Not necessarily. There's a difference. Sometimes the being judgmental has nothing to do with the opinion you have, as it has to do with how you arrived at that opinion. And I think that when it comes to polyamory, just as when it comes to marriage, there are a lot of people who get involved in a heterosexual monogamous marriage for the wrong reasons. Many women get married as a way of latching onto some guy that they're expecting to fulfill some sort of function in their lives that is really in a way of using him. And likewise, many men can marry a woman that, for various reasons, that she's a coping mechanism for them or something. And so there's a lot of people in monogamous marriages who are involved in them for reasons that are less than healthy or honest or straightforward. And I don't imagine that polyamory would be any different.
no, I absolutely agree, and that's really what I in the end wanted to get to in this conversation, is that there's more to love than what we understand, and more to love than what we expect. So I wanted to bring up the polyamory and the fact that I really cannot see any defensible legal argument why, at least with equal protection under the law, people should not be allowed to marry as many other people as they want for whatever reasons they want. But that doesn't mean necessarily that everybody is doing so out of love, um, or doing so out of that. But the thing that brings it up in my mind very specifically right now is I'm at an age, I'm 28 right now, and I am experiencing something that I guess I'd never really thought of in the past coming up to this point. But my friends have been marrying for years and having children for several years now. I mean, I have a 2-year old, and I'm certainly not. We're sort of middle of the pack for that first progeny.
Hmm.
But the unusual thing that I'm experiencing, I'd never really thought of, and it sort of made me face it, is my friends are also getting divorced, and their marriages are falling apart,
Hmm.
and it's devastating them. And I have to look at these situations and wonder why. I mean, I've known them, I've known these couples for years, and looked at what I mean, their happiness, what they shared together, and I can't understand what's coming apart with it. And I think that realistically, one of the biggest factors that gets in the way for this is trying to conform to societal norms, and not even challenging those, because even the thought of challenging those norms is offensive to some people.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. But I will tell you this. Um, if you are monogamous because of societal norms, that's not a healthy marriage. You know, the relationship that a person has with their spouse has to really be a relationship that grows out of the two of them. Societal norms may be interesting. It's also good to recognize that going against the grain is going to be problematic in many ways. First of all, you have that pressure, but secondly, you're in uncharted territory. You don't have a lot of resources to help you deal with the kinds of circumstances that come up that understand that context. So it's a tough thing. Of course, I really feel that a lot of people enter into marriage with an expectation in their spouse and no expectation in themselves. And it's as we discover the difficulty of an authentic relationship and begin to experience what some of the unanticipated expectations are upon us, we can begin to feel boxed in. And the moment we begin to feel boxed in, if we nurse that and don't allow ourselves to really consider in a multi-axial way that perspective, we're headed for divorce.
And that's really, I guess, the point that I come to be is I don't mean to challenge happy couples and happy relationships to change. You're happy, great, enjoy it. That's fantastic. I think it's silly when people look at these, oh well, if we start allowing gay marriage, what does that do to my marriage? You know what it does to your marriage?
Nothing.
Absolutely nothing, because it's not your marriage, it's somebody else's marriage. And if your marriage is going well, great. But if your marriage isn't going well, if your friendship, if your relationship, if any association for you is not going well, there's only two things that you can really do about it, and both things do, of course, need to be understood on either party, because nobody can make a relationship work if the other side's not trying. But um, the two things are do something differently or end the relationship, because it's headed that way anyway. And I just I see all of these people going into divorce for sometimes a single issue,
Yeah.
that they seem to be so happy otherwise. I mean, they have children, they have
Would you find that,
lives
what
together.
would you say is the most common problem? Some form of betrayal or money or at least in the friends you have, without,
I
I don't
think
want to
that
get
it's
anyone in trouble.
that frequently money, I think, is just a compounding factor. It makes things more stressful, but it certainly does force people's hands in many ways, and that brings out some
Mhm.
serious aggravation. But the biggest one that I see people running into is jealousy. And
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's a perfectly natural emotion, and I can't say that it's wrong or that people shouldn't be having it. But I have to say, coming from a perspective of somebody who I learned after becoming an adult that my grandfather and or my grandparents were married until my father was out of high school, their youngest, and then they divorced because they were committed to raising their children together and making their marriage work because that was the agreement that they had was to raise these children. And it was pretty well understood that my grandfather was not being faithful. He was not monogamous in this respect. And yes, that upset my grandmother, but the commitment that they had, she was willing to overlook that, which I think is a little different than being able to accept it. But it's
Yeah.
something that I think that everybody could benefit a little bit more, not necessarily on this particular issue. This is just an issue that I wanted to bring up because it really speaks volumes and it's a good example, I think. Um,
Yeah.
but on any issue, when we're looking
There's
at something that
there's
is
a
driving a
there's a
wedge
big
between
difference
us,
between the jealousy that someone might feel whose spousal partner is actually involved with someone else, and the jealousy that a person might feel because they are insecure about and worried about their partner running around or doing something like that. I'll tell you one of the things that I think that, and I've shared this with many people. One of the things that makes my own marriage so strong is that uh, both Lisa and I, we don't have a jealous bone in our body, and it's just we just don't react that way. Not to say that go ahead and do whatever you want. That's not our attitude, but jealousy is not. Neither of us feel like we own the other, and neither of us feel as though we need to control the other. Uh, we really want each other to be loyal, but voluntarily loyal. It's just not that kind of a thing, and I find that extremely attractive in a sense.
I have to agree. I mean, I came to this partially as I understood that it was entirely a social construct in my mind because I have never really experienced jealousy in any traditional sense. Not that my wife has ever really given me an opportunity to. She's never really tested that in any respect, but um, it just I don't understand the fear, and I look at jealousy specifically. I think you're right as a fear. It is an apprehension or an insecurity more than a real legitimate concern. There's certainly some things that you can be concerned about if your significant other is doing, if that they are doing something that is potentially harmful to themselves or you, or even financially speaking in any way, then you certainly should be speaking up about it. But to worry about that and to be fearful of it to such a degree that even if it's not happening, it's ruining your marriage, I think that the jealousy itself is what's driving these people apart more than any amount of actual
Right.
infidelity would if they simply understood and were being honest with each other. And I think that once again it boils down to honesty, that
Uh-huh.
absolute and frank honesty. But we're not capable of that. We're afraid of that as couples, of telling somebody that something's wrong, you're not happy about something, that you feel you're missing something, because you may be attracted to another person outside of your marriage because that person is filling a need that you have that you've never even voiced to your spouse. So they can't possibly know how to be there to be that person for you.
Why do
And
they even need to, though? I mean, think of it, in this respect. You know, what if my wife were to discover there's some other guy out there who actually has more money than I have?
that's
Well,
possible.
wonderful, that he's got more money than it. Um, our relationship isn't built upon the money. One of the things that I think that I feel very fortunate about was that both my wife and I were in agreement before we even got married that we wanted to enter into a relationship where we got to have each other, but where we did not need each other. And so we from the very beginning did not want to build our relationship on some form of dependency on the other. And not that, it's easier said than done, but we really wanted to value the cooperative aspect of our relationship, and to minimize the dependent nature of our relationship, because only when you're really in that kind of a situation are you really prepared to even negotiate honestly and fairly and for what you need and want, you know.
I have to agree. I think that there's certainly a strong argument to be made for looking at a relationship that way. And there is a flip side to this argument. When I say that I think that people are too unwilling to test or to question the assumptions that they hold, I also think that people are too unwilling to recognize um, when they are not willing to change and accept that.
Mhm, mhm,
Because, as I said, I am in a monogamous relationship with my wife. And that is the expectation that we both hold for one another. And that was the expectation we had on the day we got married. If either of us wanted that to change, that would be something that we need to clear with the other person. It's something that
mhm.
would require discussion and open, honest exposition of those feelings for many reasons. Again, one, it might allow you to discover a way that you can grow closer together in something that they didn't even know you felt lacking or didn't even know the reality of. And two, because it's dishonest to do something a one-sided decision when you're not a single entity in this respect. So as much as I certainly advocate for being willing to question the paradigms that you have accepted coming into it, you also need to understand if your significant other, or even if you yourself cannot change those paradigms and are unwilling to change those, and to be honest about that. Because I think that the other side of this is I talk about my grandparents and my grandmother being willing to stay with my grandfather, knowing what he was doing during my father's teen years until he was legally an adult. But
Yeah.
they got divorced immediately after,
Ah,
meaning that she did this out of service to my
right.
dad and not because she
Not all
wanted to.
people possess the skills to know how to successfully confront someone else in a way that they can count on being effective. And they may feel, they're choosing the lesser of the evils they're aware of. That's a sad thing. I can see where how that would lead to an immediate divorce. There wasn't a real relationship going on, a great deal of resentment. Wow, I can't imagine. Um, I myself, like when I was last time that I was in a band, it was a band that didn't belong to any one of us, and we understood we were going to run the band by consensus, and we did. But because it wasn't my band, as it were, I didn't mind doing that by consensus. So I can be a partner with other people in an enterprise. But I used to own a karate studio. I can't picture myself being a partner with anybody in that. I wouldn't want to be, stuck into a partnership that way unless I was, somebody I could really deeply trust. And so most of the things I've been involved in at that level, when I'm the owner, when I'm personally invested in it like that, I'm not open to it. And I got to tell you, I, you know, with a relationship, I'm not so sure that I could tolerate anything other than the monogamy.
Well, and that's
uh,
exactly the point that I was trying to get
yeah,
at there, Bob. We are out of time, but I wanted to say, as my final point, is that I think in the end, looking again back at the relationship that my grandparents had, is that non-monogamy is not something that everybody and anybody can do or should do. There's
right.
nothing wrong with it for those who would like to be a part of it or who don't have or take issue with it. But I believe that in the situation as it exposed itself, that what happened between my grandparents was my grandfather taking advantage of the situation and not being honest with himself about what he was doing to my grandmother.
Right.
And I think that there's only two ways that a relationship can go. Again, you can decide to change or you can end the relationship. And it is a true shame when there are expectations that allow only one side to change.
Hmm.
And it's an unfair situation, it's coercive. And in the end, I really don't know what my closing point is on that, but that I think that the most important thing in any relationship and true love is honesty
Hmm.
and nothing more. Being able to be exactly who you are and expose exactly who you are to other people and having them accept that. This has been Inspiring Honesty. Stick around for the Unconventional Pastor coming up next. And of course, The Place Tonight with Dr. Michael W. Jones. I'll be joining. And Bob, are you going to be part of that?
I plan to, yes.
And we will be joined by PZ Myers once again from the blog Pharyngula, which is part of Free Thought Blogs Network. Um, Thank you for joining us. Tune in again next week for Inspiring Honesty. And don't forget Clash Course coming on immediately before this one.
Well, good evening, and it's good to be back here again with you on this Sunday evening. It's also Mother's Day, a remarkable day for a number of people, and a difficult day for a lot of others, and all sorts of things in between. Which is, in a sense, a little bit of what I wanted to talk about. Um, I want to first of all acknowledge the width and the breadth and the depth of this day. There are a number of people who have certainly grown up in wonderful families where a Mother's Day or Father's Day or some of these kinds of days like that are just really awesome days that they treasure. There are families where there's some perhaps even mixed feelings about this, and it's not too uncommon that you will find that daughters will oftentimes be far more attached to dads than they are to moms, and sons will sometimes be far more attached to moms than they are to dads. And then there's, of course, families where the attachment isn't very strong at all. And the people involved in those families, as even children, come in a variety of different forms of uh, resilience and their ability to deal the hand that they've been dealt. But it leaves us each in a very different set of circumstances, so that each of us come towards days like this very, very uniquely. And so I wanted to talk about that. First of all, it's not necessarily required that parents be perfect. There just aren't any that come in that shape or form, and therefore, if we're going to be really uh, disturbed or bothered by the fact that our parents dared be people who weren't perfect, we're really kind of being unreasonable and unrealistic in our expectations of them. Even if there's ways in which the lack of perfection in your parents may have been a price that you had to pay at some level. That's pretty much par for the course in living in a world filled with people who are themselves figuring things out and not necessarily always doing well. It's just a part of the natural scheme of things. And I think we all need to kind of come to terms with that, so that we find that an acceptable place to be dealing from. And so I'd like to encourage most of you listening in that regardless of what your experience may have been, that you find that now as an adult, the ball is in your court, and making sense of all of this and appreciating it to the degree that you can or should or shouldn't is, in a sense, kind of now your responsibility. But I've known a number of people who are very very thankful for their families, and who find days like this to be just meaningful and wonderful days. I've also known a number of people who are somewhere in between. They're just, it's okay, and they've made the best of it, and they'd rather be dealing with the issues that they're dealing with than not dealing with them at all. But I do also have a few people that I know whose experience in growing up was so powerfully negative that that days like this just not only lack significance, but are downright hostile, the way that they experience them. So I want to talk to many people who may have experienced this. And part of the reason I want to talk about this is not just because of my own personal experience, uh, but because in religious circles, where a lot of the people who listen to me, even those of you who are not any longer part of institutionalized religion, may have grown up with it. And there's a reason why you're no longer involved in it. And as people who have been, the more rigidly religious, the more likely it is that there's going to be a certain amount of disappointment over one's childhood experience. And so I think there's a great number of people in the audience here who, if this isn't their case, they know plenty of people for whom it is the case that Mother's Day is just not a good day for them. Now, I can say that it's for me a very different kind of day in that I'm very, very happily married. I have a daughter who still lives with us. And th- being family is a very meaningful thing to me. And I appreciate so much the kind of mother that my wife really endeavors to be. And one of the things that I think is just awesome about her is she's also professionally, she's a nanny. And so she takes care of a lot of kids. And she's been doing this since before we got married in 1988. And over the years, she has really learned ways of dealing with kids that she's really very good at it, and she cares about these kids. And of course, one thing all parents learn is that it's a lot easier to be objective with the responsibilities of other people's children than it is with your own, and sometimes the investment you have in your own children makes it exasperating even more so. So, sometimes that's where we're more likely to even find that our triggers are tripped or we're kind of losing it. But so I find that though being a father and married to a person who is a mother is a very different experience than that which I grew up in. And I grew up in a home where, without going into too much detail, both my mother and father are dead. And each of my siblings, I have five sisters. One has already passed, and I have a brother. Each of us had differing senses of a connection to our parents. I was child number five in the list. Uh, and most of us were 2 years apart, basically. And I had a younger brother who was actually, kind of 11 years after the child older than him. But for me, I can honestly say that although both of my parents are gone, I don't miss them. I didn't really know them that well. Was not as attached to them. Did not feel that they were attached to me, and so it left me in some ways in an abandoned childhood in a sense in that way. So, needless to say, it came with its challenges and some of the difficulties that would be part of that. So, what I really hope to talk about today, therefore, is this: I don't think that I'm a person who suffers from the consequences of that anywhere near the way I used to be. In fact, I don't even see myself as suffering from it at all. And yet I'd have to admit there was a time in my life when I suffered horribly from it. That growing up in a home where I really don't recall any time that my father ever had kind words for me. I don't remember it. He didn't have mean words to me where he came across with violent anger or anything. He just anything that may have been worth kindly saying to me didn't strike him as anything appropriate to say or that the situation really called for. And he regarded me in a way I perceived as just kind of inept and not lacking in I was lacking in adulthood, and the process that I needed to go through to develop into an adult was one he didn't seem to appreciate or understand or have patience for. And I have no memory of any kind words from him. None. I don't remember holding his hands or hugging him, except for maybe on one or two occasions, um, which would have been extremely rare. I don't remember ever sitting down and having a conversation with my dad when I was growing up, just to sit about, talk about football or talk about anything. I don't remember ever having any such conversation. Um, and although there was a closeness with my mother, when it came to my mother was, for whatever reasons, and I don't know that I really understand them, we had, five girls in the family and two boys. And my younger brother was 13 years younger than me. So he was just a little baby at the time I'm really struggling with life as a teenager. And by the time I had grown old enough to leave home, he was just, getting, uh, out of elementary school. So I'm not really even clear how the home life would have been for him specifically, other than the ways we've talked about it since then. Certainly a very different experience. But I certainly experienced my own mom as somebody who uh, favored her sons more than her daughters. Actually, I don't recall seeing anything that gave me the impression she had a connection with my sisters of a meaningful sort. Of course, I wasn't in those relationships, so I can't really speak for it that well. But at the same time, the relationship that I had with my mom was one where I I I got the impression that she favored me in a way that wasn't right, but that she also resented the fact that I was destined to become one of the enemy, that I was going to grow up and become a man. And that seemed to me to be something that deeply disturbed her. And of course, growing up, I wanted to, since my dad didn't pay any attention to me at all. The attention I did get from my mom was something I was ready to drink up. Oh, and because of that, I was even willing to kind of submit to the terms in a way where I found myself comfortable with the fact that I could at least be liked by somebody who really knew that I was just going to grow up and become a betrayer of everything decent and right, and it was just who I was. Needless to say, that's not a very healthy attitude about mom, and not a healthy attitude about dad, not a healthy attitude about self. But this is the way that I certainly entered into adult life, and it presented to me a great number of problems in being able to function in the world in a responsible and mature manner. And I didn't, quite a mess there for a number of years. But I do want to talk, therefore, about okay, so those of us who have been through this sort of situation, without regard to what depth or degree we're talking about, whether it's just something that was a bit of a problem to something that was just totally devastating. I want to talk to you about what I see as some of the useful ways of getting on the other side of it. Now, at first, when I became more of a fundamentalist Christian at around the age of 18, I was really kind of hoping that this would like solve all my problems, and was quite distressed and disturbed when I was discovering and having to be honest about the fact that it wasn't doing anything at all. But I certainly passed through this phase where I began to try to embrace the idea that, well, this was all a part of God's plan, that I went through all of that disappointment and difficulty in childhood, and the sense of shame and of being inadequate to life. That this was all somehow God's way of preparing me for something that was going to be very useful to His purposes. But really, all it ended up doing was turning me into an immature idiot, and making me a person totally unprepared to be a healthy influence on others to the degree that I would have wanted to be, and really incapable of taking responsibility for my own life. And so it wasn't working, and it never really got around well to doing that from inside of that particular paradigm, which I had to really uh, admit to myself. And I came to the point where I found that I couldn't accept or embrace that typical Christian attitude that, well, all of this happened for a reason. Because to me, uh, I didn't see the reason coming to fruition, and I didn't understand the appropriateness or the fairness of how long is this going to take before I get there. Uh, and or before it becomes meaningful, and how much suffering and stupidity is a person supposed to tolerate in their own life before it all starts to work well and come together. And if it all happens for a reason, then whoever's making it happen has to accept a certain amount of responsibility for the fact that it's happening. And of course, from that standpoint, that would mean it's God's fault and God's problem, and uh, what have you. But for me, there was a distancing that I found. I just logically couldn't embrace that kind of paradigm anymore. And I would suggest that if you're a person who has suffered that kind of approach to the relationship you had with your parents. That's fine. It's okay for you to recognize that you can't really necessarily embrace that traditional Christian attitude that you're asked to take on, that somehow doesn't really validate the damage, the pain, the distraughtness, the confusion in anything like that. So there was that distance. But for me, there was a radical turning around point, a number of them. But one of the radical turning around points was was a time when I was actually dealing with a person who was actually a pastor from another church that I'd gotten to know and gotten to respect because he was an amazing scholar. And he eventually left the ministry, and he's today actually a psychotherapist and a professor of philosophy. But I was talking with him and talking to him about the anger that I felt about how inadequate to life and how well, what's the word I'm looking for? I felt so uh, inept as a human being, as if there were parts of me that were just missing, and that I just wasn't a real, whole, dignified, acceptable human being. And that in feeling this way, I was so angry at my father and my mother for the roles they played in in making that such a coherent experience for me, that it even made sense to me that, oh, well, I looked at the evidence and obviously I am an inept human being. Obviously, I'm a poor excuse of a human being. Obviously, there's something seriously wrong with me that is just part of my innateness and self. And as a result, of course, there's nothing I can do about it. And if anything, my Christianity would confirm the fact that, oh, this is just the sin nature working its way through. And I was expressing a lot of this anger, and this pastor, a counselor to me, said something to me that really hit me square between the eyes. He said, "Well, look, that's all very, very true. It's true, and I can understand your anger, but you need to accept something here that's very, very true, and that is this: I want to make the argument that all of those things that you experienced didn't do any damage to you until you accepted the notion that it said something about you. In other words, when your father was very hypercritical, that hypercriticism didn't really damage you until you embraced it as valid. And this was not to blame me. He was not saying, and so you shouldn't have done that. He's saying, as a child, you just don't have the skills with which to understand how to deal with that. And so it's not at all surprising that you embraced it. You're also a dependent child. Your continued happiness, there's going to be any, depends upon your submitting to the circumstance and situation in which you're in. So it makes complete sense that you would embrace this. But he wanted to make it very clear that this didn't damage me in any manner until I did embrace it. And he said, and here's the good news: if you're the one who embraced it and that's what did the damage, then you're also the one who can reject it and undo the damage. You don't need your mom or your dad to get it. You don't need them to apologize. You don't need them to change. You don't need to even have them open to any kind of resolve of this at all. You alone had the power to embrace it as a child, and that's what did the damage. And now, as an adult, you alone possess the power to reject it and thereby find a healing and something outside of it. And it made a lot of sense to me what he was saying. And I had to realize that there was great hope in that, a great deal of hope. In fact, it's what began me starting a practice of something that I don't even recall how I got into it. Just perhaps for some reading, and maybe I was reading somewhere in the relaxation response, and I just kind of combined a lot of ideas that I was getting, and I started sitting in this chair And I would sit in this chair on a regular basis, and I would just, in my mind's eye, I would remember events from my own childhood. And events that were for me personally painful, full of embarrassment, full of shame, full of discovering the inadequate human being I am. Moments that when I went through just proved to me just how unacceptable I was as an excuse of a human being. And I would go back through these events, and I would relive them, as it were. And then I would, after I relived them as a little child, as it were, I would I would go to sit at this little tree, and while I sat there, the adult me would arrive and come up to me, and I didn't know it's the adult me. To me, it's just a total stranger. And then I, as the adult me, would talk to the little me and ask me how I felt, and ask me what I was thinking, and ask me what it made me think about myself. And the adult me began talking to the little me, saying things like, well, look, I can understand how that could make you feel inadequate. But do you think it makes any sense that maybe they're the ones that are feeling inadequate and you just haven't grown up enough learning how to deal with those things? So of course and I tried to speak to my younger self in a far more accepting, understanding way, and giving to my younger self, as it were, the opportunity to change what I thought those events said about me. And I found that I did this, and I do this over and over and over again. And sometimes I would relive some of those experiences, close to a dozen times. And sometimes the adult me would talk to the little me, trying to get me to conclude different things about myself that are therefore obviously to be concluded from the event. But sometimes I also talk to myself about coming to different conclusions about uh, the adults in my life, conclusions that help me to understand they have problems. They don't know what they're doing. Maybe they wish they did. Maybe they don't know how to handle this. Maybe they don't even know how to say they're sorry. And in ways where I try to at least empathize and understand the kind of points or places they were coming from, so that I could even also better understand how these events don't really say anything about me. And it helped me to really let go of and distance from myself the just unquestioned assumption that I must be an inadequate human being. It was a tremendously healing experience for me. And as a result of this, I got to the point where I had to take a look at my own very unhappy childhood. And I got to the point where I had to do one very important thing. I had to learn to accept it. That this is the childhood that I had. That's just the way it was. There's nothing that we can do to change the past, and being angry about it isn't going to help. Although being angry about it might help reassert some of my dignity, and that's useful. Um, there was nonetheless this non-negotiable sense of reality that this is the way it was, and so accept it, that it happened. Accept the fact that it is my history. That doesn't mean I have to accept what I thought it said about me. And it doesn't even mean I have to accept that my understanding and my version of that history was an accurate one. As a fact, as it turns out, I discovered in many ways that in some ways, a lot of my memories were exaggerated traumas. That not everything happened exactly the way that I remembered it. That I even got to the point where I would take certain things personally that weren't even intended to be aimed at me. I just was already in that mode, and so that was the sense I made of things, and I had to be in some ways honest about it, but without regard of validating the accuracy of my understanding. I had to come to the point where, well, this is where I am today. This is what happened, and this is how I experienced it. And if I'm going to move forward from here, I have to find it completely acceptable that this is where I move forward from. And I had to completely accept it. And I had to realize that there's nobody in my life who's going to be able to accept it other than me, and that it's nobody's problem or nobody's responsibility to accept it other than myself. And so I did. I got to that point where I realized I had to embrace this as my reality and my problem. And that if there was going to be any changes, they were now with the ball in my court and in my hands. parents. And so that's what I had to do. There's a few other things that I also had to realize that I needed to do, that I had to actually, some things I even had to stop doing. I had to realize that there were some things that I was doing that were very much like what my own parents were doing. And some of that was simply because I didn't realize that that's what I was doing, or I didn't know better. It was the only way I knew. And there were other things I was doing that were the exact opposite of the way I was raised. And I had to realize that that's not a good idea either, because I had to come to the realization that sometimes parents who fail not because they don't care about their kids. Many times these parents fail because they're trying to do something quite different from what their parents did to them. And they don't realize that in doing that, um, they're creating other problems. I think that even in the way that this affected or applies to my own parents, this took me a while to discover that there was a certain amount of abandonment that both my parents were involved in, where they never gave us advice. They never gave it to me. If I had a problem or a question about what to deal with something, they were not a resource for me at all. And if I were to ask them, they would resist the question. And it wasn't until much older in life that I discovered that my parents made a pact among themselves, that they had found their own parents so controlling that they had decided they were not going to give advice to their kids. I grew up not having any clue what their political positions were, what party they belonged to, or a lot of these other issues of where they could share their perspective. And they deliberately decided to do that. In a sense, that was their reaction to parents who were always trying to control what they thought or what they were going to do. And there's a sense in which, although I experienced it as abandonment, and although I think there was a sense in which it was not necessarily their intended abandonment. It was really their attempt to not do to their kids what their parents had done to them. Viewer comment: wow, Bob, you're really opening up here. I appreciate and admire your courage. Well, thank you. um, I'm 61 now, so this kind of is old hat. But I'll tell you this: I do think that when I first started opening up to this, I appreciate your comment, because I think at that time it took a lot of courage in myself. And I can even come to the point where I can pat myself on the back and say, good job, Bob. That wasn't easy to do coming from where you came from. And so thank you. I appreciate your saying as much. That's very kind of you. Um, I had to not only learn to not go in this opposite direction, I had to get to the point where I had to objectively kind of identify what I thought were the mistakes. And I say that I had to identify what I thought were the mistakes because I found I had to be very open to the fact that, you know, at the time that I experienced those mistakes, I didn't really possess the skills or the ability to assess them as mistakes. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. Maybe the mistake was the insensitive way in which some of those decisions were applied, but the mistakes weren't necessarily the decisions themselves. I couldn't tell, and I don't know that I had the ability to tell. And so I had to be honest with myself about that. But it was nonetheless important to me to identify specifically what I saw as the mistakes and recognize that this is just what I see as mistakes. And I also had to learn to identify in myself specifically what it was that I saw as the damage. Well, in what ways did this hurt me? And in what ways did this impede my healthy development? And so it was helpful to me to do that. And there are ways in which I also, with that, when I say seems to have impeded my development, I had to realize there that I don't know what my full potential could have been or what areas I could have really developed. And so here again, I'm still working with a working model of insight. Um, and I had to ask myself, am I really being entirely honest? And here was one of the things that I think that really helped me a lot. In fact, my wife has even shared this with me that she actually went through something like this, and we both had difficult childhoods in a similar way. And I think that in one ways, we both were able to admire each other for the fact that we both, kind of independently, faced a lot of those problems in a with a similar kind of courage and a similar sort of independence. But in my honesty, one of the things that I found that I had to do is I had to stop looking for people who would take my side. If I was, for example, expressing to someone about, the way that my father would humiliate me, the last thing I needed was for somebody to say, "Well, Bob, that's terrible. What a bastard he was. You know how terrible that was of him." I don't need someone to take my side because, as I said before, I don't really always fully understand what was going on there. I just know how I experienced it. And so what I needed was from someone to be able to acknowledge and recognize what my experience was, how I experienced it, and what I need to do about it now. But I don't need somebody to take my side. And so that was also a very helpful thing for me to do. In some ways, I suppose it can be validating. I'd rather a person validate, though, that my experience was my experience, that they validate that the way my experience made me feel is something that they can appreciate that would make me feel that way. But it doesn't help me to somehow validate my conclusions as accurate because they weren't always accurate. And sometimes that can impede even the healing because just as I said, you don't want to do what your parents did, but you don't want to do the opposite either. What you want to do is you want to become the you are who can respond to life the way it is in a way that is the wisest way possible without any regard to what anyone else may or may not have done or what they should have done or what they didn't do or what you wanted them to do. That doesn't matter. Those aren't the points. Life is lived successfully because one can face it for what it is and finds within themselves the skills and the resources to respond to it in a way that is effective and meaningful, that has a future. And that may or may not be the same or the opposite or anything in relationship to what one was raised with. And so I was not looking for people to take my side. I was rather more looking for people who could empathize with the experience, offer me insight and advice about myself, help me discover my true self, and help me move on from there. Um, so I had to learn what was actually really behind my problems and how problems develop. And I had to be kind and good to myself in understanding the sort of damage that does naturally come to a person going through that kind of very disappointing perspective. We have more viewer comments here. Of your comment, many people spend their entire lives trying to understand their God, and the last place that they look for educational materials is within their own selves. I've come to find that the journey of understanding yourself is one of the most, perhaps the most difficult journey by far, and certainly far more difficult than that of understanding one's God. Very true. I'd have to agree that there are many obstacles that impede an honest and clear and courageous journey into to self. But let me share with you, though, that in light of that, that some of the things that I discovered along that journey for myself was this: that ultimately speaking, all emotions are a form of self affirmation of dignity. I mean that. When things were painful to me, I learned that the reason why it hurts is because I'm a valuable human being and it's supposed to hurt. I learned to not resent the fact that it hurt. I would rather that the abandonment and the emotional abuse that I went through as a child was something that hurt, because that's exactly the way a person who's really valuable should respond to that, with pain. And I got to the point where instead of pain being my history and my lot in life, pain became the expression of my innate self saying, no, 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 there's something very dignified and valuable here that's being hurt. And that's why it hurts. And so I found that in the discovery of self, that in the root of self was in some ways the revelation of self value, of self worth, and that was an extremely powerful experience. in discovering that that's really what, even anger. I found myself that the key to me in understanding what was really behind that advice, be angry and do not sin, was that I discovered that anger is, in for me, was a natural response to perceiving something as unjust and abusive and damaging and threatening to that which is valuable. And there's a sense in which what I learned was that it's just a feeling. I found that I was able to deal with anger so much easier by doing nothing with it except feeling it and allowing it to give me opportunity to consider, well, is this thing that I value really valuable? Is it really being threatened? Is it really being treated unjustly? And if I could come to the point where I felt it that it really was something valuable and something being treated abusively or unjustly, then being angry was for me an extremely acceptable thing to do because it reaffirmed the value. And what do I do about the anger? Well, nothing. Nothing. I let it reaffirm the dignity and the value, and I just embrace the anger. It helps me to kind of bring back to center the declaration of value. And once I had done that, I found the anger just went away. It had done its work. I needed nothing else. And if there was something to do, the anger would be gone, and I could now see clearly and think objectively and carefully about what might be the most effective thing, if anything, to do in response to the injustice or the threat, or to reverse it or turn it around or whatever, you know. And so there were many of these things that happened where I had to learn ways of okay, working with the problems. How do I deal with this particular hand? What are its strengths? What are its weaknesses? What can I turn into strengths that I didn't have before? And I'll tell you this. Um, I learned one of the things I learned along the way very clearly was this: almost every human being judges other people and their motives based on what they see other people do, how they understand what it is they're doing, and what it would take for me to do that. And this is a way of not really seeing someone else for who they are. Um, and so, if, as an example, if you see somebody who's involved in a kind of a business deal that you find overly harsh or perhaps dishonest, you might be right, you might be wrong, but at the same time, what you see them doing, just because it's something you couldn't do unless you were going to be dishonest, doesn't mean that they're doing this because they're being dishonest. They might be doing something they were taught to do, or they feel is right, or they've been taught some philosophy they've really embraced, and they don't really see the harm in it, even if it really is harmful. So it's important that we recognize that in judging other people, that people do what they do for the reasons that make sense to them, and they don't do what they're doing for the reasons that it would take me to do those things. And by dealing with that, I found that I had to actually work on my problems, and when helping other people, helping them deal with their problems from the standpoint at which they experience them. And to be able to make that difference and that distance in recognizing that people are motivated from within the paradigm of their own perspective that may or may not be anything like my own perspective, that was something that I learned so clearly through the process of coming out of my own difficulties. And that's a particular strength that I think I probably wouldn't have ever had if I didn't realize that there were some ways unique and particular and peculiar about the way that I even created my own problems through my own perspective and the things that I embraced. And so that's a way in which I actually took some of the unfortunate experiences that I had and actually turned them into an opportunity for strength, which, by the way, is something you can do. It doesn't mean it was meant to happen or that this is the best of all possible worlds, but it did teach me something else. It doesn't really, in some ways, if you're still alive, no matter what has happened, no matter what it has done to you, there's a way of taking that and finding in it the insight and the wisdom that can be very useful and helpful to other people, both in their healing or in their avoiding that kind of a situation. We have another viewer comment. First time listener, watcher. So far, I'm really enjoying this guy right now. Well, thank you. And a very, very nice comment. I appreciate that. Now, what are some other things that you can do in dealing with the fact that maybe the way you were parented didn't work out so well for you? For one thing, some of you may have to decide that that this parenting thing isn't going to be the sort of thing you have a sufficient background to take on yourself. You might decide that. You might be wrong. You might be right. But if you are going to decide to be a parent, one of the things I'd suggest you do is look into a variety of different parenting classes and learn some things that can help make up the difference of things you didn't have well modeled for you in your own upbringing. I myself, before when my wife became pregnant for our daughter, before she was born, we both took these classes from Dinkmeyer called the Systematic Training for Effective Parenting, and we looked at that philosophy and that approach, and we really gleaned a great deal from it. I know it helped me a great deal in realizing that what is my goal as a father, and what's a healthy, mature way of coming at my role as a parent. And I found the book very helpful, and the course, but I also found that it took time for a lot of what it talked about to sink in, and then it was there was a learning curve involved and a comprehension curve involved. But I would suggest that if you're going to do that, that you learn various different parental techniques and approaches. And one of the things that I remember reading that I thought was particularly unique was a piece of advice that went like this: there are a lot of parental ideas out there and philosophies and techniques. I suggest you look at all of them, and I suggest that you don't have a favorite, because chances are your favorite parental style is going to be something you are comfortable with. And when it comes to adopting a parental style, the truth is every human being is a little bit different. The parental style you want to at least become good at, I think, first of all, is a wide variety of them. But secondly, to realize the parental style you're going to need is the parental style that is most effective and useful to your child. Some children are naturally more compliant. They don't need some sort of authoritarian person who's going to just kind of take control and push them about. They don't need that. They can be kind of urged along and kindly guided. There are going to be other children, though, who are very, very willful, and they may need a more authoritative style than you're comfortable with. And to me, I'm going to say, you may not like that, but that's too damn bad. If you really want to be a good parent to this child, you're really going to have to discern as carefully as you can, and I would get outside opinions about it from people who know what they're talking about, not just friends, not just people who can take sides, either the side of the child or your side as a parent. But uh, you need to learn to adopt the parental style that is going to be most effective with each particular child, because that's what they need. In other words, it's not about you, it's about the children. And so, therefore, you want to come up with a parental style and a parental philosophy that is well suited to the particular personality of each of your children. And that may be different. You don't have to raise your children all by the same rules or the same terms. They're each different, and it's not going to be fair to the one for whom that doesn't fit in so well, and it's going to be overly advantageous to the one to whom it does. So there's nothing wrong with responding to each of your children as is in keeping with their particular needs. And there's no need to apologize for that either. You may have to introduce some other terms of equalizing what appears to be unfair, and you need to be honest about it. But I would suggest that you learn, you discover various different parenting ideas, not only for the sake of your children, but for the sake of kind of reparenting yourself. I had to become my own dad. I had to become my own mother, as it were, and kind of lift me back through the processes and the challenges of life, where I didn't come through those challenges at the first time as productively as would have been helpful to move on to the next phase, and the challenges that would follow after that. And so that was something very important for me to be able to do. And studying some of these parental approaches was very helpful. In fact, to be honest with you, later I even went back to college for a third, fourth time, uh, and obtained a degree in human development, which for me was just an eye opener, and I enjoyed it thoroughly. Thought I learned so much more about how I became who I was in a manner that that established for me and affirmed my dignity and the dignity of all human beings, and their need for genuine care, love, and responsiveness that helps them to own their own behavior, their own choices, and their own dignity. Um, now, it's also important that in responding to a lot of this in your past, that you stop using what happened to you as an excuse. The truth is, all of us, myself included, have this ability to take a look at this story we call our story, my life, and see ourselves as fitting some sort of role in life. And now starting to spin everything else as if this is the role I'm supposed to play. That becomes an excuse. Okay, so I'm always being put down. Well, now I'm going to push myself around because I've always been pushed around and now it's my turn. No, 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 no. Or using the ways in which I've been damaged. And so, well, that's why I have to do this and do that because I have to make up for this. I have to compensate. No, you don't have to do it. We want to avoid using the things that happen to you as an excuse to not grow, as an excuse to not have to find a way of taking responsibility for making up the difference to the way that you can. And also, another excuse you want to avoid is this one. There may be some damage you're not going to deal with well. That can't be an excuse. You're just going to have to find a way of accommodating it. Let me share with you a very personal thing. My father was an extremely authoritative and very critical man. I find that when I'm in a working situation, I cannot function well if the person I'm answerable to in an organization is somebody who is both critical and authoritative. In fact, I actually went through a period of my adult life where I went into some amnesia through the trauma of trying to work for a boss who was like that. I was one day sitting at my desk trying to do a tax return, and all of my procedural memory was gone. I couldn't remember how to use a calculator. And I lost the job, of course. And I went through a few years there where my memory and of how to do things was so traumatized. It was gone. And it was a very tough time for me. But I've learned since then that I'm not good at dealing with people who are like that. And so I refuse to accept any kind of responsibility where I would have to be answerable to or work for anybody with that kind of a personality. I won't do it. And I've also, in the meantime, learned very effective ways of standing up to people who are like that, letting them know that on no uncertain terms will I find that way of relating to me acceptable. And I won't do it. And I will call them on it and tell them that, look, if you want me to work productively for you, something I'm willing to do, you're just going to have to pick another technique because I'm not going to work for that one. And what if they fire me? Well, who cares? Because I'm not going to work under that technique. I can't do it anyway. So I've got nothing to lose and everything to gain. And I found that I did even develop some winsome ways of dealing with people who try to pull that authority card on me, till the point where I'd actually taken some people who would use that and turn them into friends, people who respected the fact that I'd stand up to them. And that gave me a little bit better ability to even deal with that sort of people, that sort of person, and to stand up for myself, which was helpful. But this is all part of my saying, don't allow the things that happen to you to become your excuse for being the kind of person you now have the right to be or have to be. You can still become, to whatever degree is possible, the person you really can be. And that's what you really want to be. That's what you want to become. That's what you want to help other people become. So we don't want to turn what's happened to us into excuses. Um, you know, you have used to abuse to justify yourself. That's not going to be helpful in dealing with the world. Um, and of course, one of the things that I want to end up in saying is this: I also had to get to the point where I didn't hold it against my parents at all. I can be honest about the fact that they didn't do a very good job. But hey, they didn't. I don't really know entirely why. But I suppose there were reasons for it. And somebody once asked me, "Do you forgive your father?" For he's dead, he's gone now. Do you forgive your father? And I said, no, but I don't hold it against him either. I got to the point where I just sought to enjoy him as a person who was there, and the day may come in the life to come where he recognizes the way he behaved and the impact it had on me. And when he realizes that, I'm sure he'll say, "Oh, Bob, I'm so sorry." And I'll say, "Oh, don't worry about it, Dad." And I'll forgive him then. I have every intention of doing that. But until he can see that, I don't see the usefulness of forgiving him, as it were. It happened. I don't have to hold it against him. I don't have to somehow swallow it all. I'm not going to do any of that. I'm just going to be me and be the best me that I can be, and recognize that who my parents were is a story I may not always understand, but I want to love them and respect them, understand as best I can, and be willing to allow that reconciliation to occur when it happens. So anyway, I just wanted to talk to you today about that being Mother's Day, that some of you are going to be looking at this day in a way that hasn't been for you an entirely happy experience, and share with you how that has worked for me. And hopefully that is going to be of help to you and useful. That's all I have for you today. I'm Bob Graves. They call me the Unconventional Pastor, and we'll talk to you later. Take care.
Ladies and gentlemen, stick around. In just a moment, Dr. Michael W. Jones and Rhonda Jones will be up on stage, and we will be joined by special guest P.Z. Myers. It's going to be an exciting discussion about all kinds of things, and it's going to be a night you're not going to want to miss. Also joining us will be Bob Graves and Greg Bray, so stay tuned.